Well, welcome back, everyone. We're going to make a start now on our second session, and this is going to be chaired by Natasha Chawla. So as well as being the co-organizer of this conference, Natasha is doing her PhD in the Faculty of Theology and Religion here in Oxford, and her dissertation looks at the relationship between nature, the environment, and human beings through the eyes of the polymath Rabindranath Tagore. So Natasha, if you'd like to take it away with the next session.
Thanks, Tim. So it's my pleasure to introduce the speakers for the first of two sessions of Theology and Religions in Time, Professor Angelika Malinar and Professor James Miller. Angelika Malinar is Professor of Indian Studies at the University of Zurich, where she has been engaged in the University Research Priority Programme Asia and Europe, amongst many other things. Her PhD dissertation on the Bhagavad Gita, which was published in 1996 as the Bhagavad Gita Doctrines and Contexts, has become a staple in the life of any student of world religion. She is a co-editor of the Handbuch der Orientalistik and the multi-volume Brill's Encyclopedia of Hinduism. James Miller is the inaugural Professor of Humanities, co-director of the Humanities Research Centre and Associate Dean for Interdisciplinary Strategy at Duke Kunshan University. He is also Editor-in-Chief of the academic journal Worldviews, Global Religions, Culture and Ecology. And over the past 18 years, he has published 6 books on Chinese religions, including recently, in 2007, China's Green Religion. A very warm welcome to both of you, Professor Malinar and Professor Miller. For all the attendees, a quick reminder to please put your questions in the Q&A box and upvote any questions of particular interest. And Professor Malinar, I'll hand it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Natasha, and thank you for inviting me and having me today. So good morning to everyone. For quite a long time, influential modern Western perceptions of Indian culture and religions focused on difference. More often than not, East-West differences were construed as pointing to a superiority of the West as a driving force of cultural and civilizational progress. An important dimension of colonial rule in South Asia and elsewhere was to demonstrate this superiority not only through political and economic regimes of power, but also at an epistemic level. More often than not, this meant historicizing and traditionalizing Indian intellectual discourses and religions. In this way, the relevancy of these discourses for contemporary modern issues was delimited. The interplay between these different levels of implementing Western hegemony is an important topic in my discipline, as you might guess, and is often discussed in connection with debates about Orientalism and the post-colonial condition. This constellation is also at play when addressing a topic such as deep time across cultures, as I understand also the list of invited colleagues here in this conference. And I think that indeed across cultures is the only way to deal with the issue of deep time and the ecological crisis in the humanities. I was invited to this event in order to also include non-European perspectives, which is of course highly appreciated, and this is why I of course also accepted this invitation. But as my preliminary remarks suggest, this welcome interest requires an awareness of the colonial modern regimes of power that made non-European a category when classifying cultures and marking disciplinary boundaries in the humanities. So dealing with what one could address or call Indian perceptions on the issue of deep time implies addressing one manifestation of the colonial modern East-West dichotomy, well, the well-known opposition between so-called linear time or Western linear time and Eastern cyclical time. This opposition between these two different ways of seeing and experiencing time is marking the West as the site of history, progress, and modernity, and the East as devoid of history, but having repetition and owning what could be seen as the non-modern idea of time, society, and history. This opposition became highly influential across discipline, and although Indologists have written a lot of pages trying to, in a way, disprove this view of cyclical time, it still allows contrasting Christianity with Asian religions like Hinduism and Buddhism. Christianity was cast as a religion focusing on the individual human being and his and her salvation in a single lifetime and within the one and only world and history created by God. In contrast to that, Buddhism and Hinduism were viewed as religions that do not recognize the value of individual existence and of the importance of the presence and of present time, because they teach doctrines of transmigration, which would be, in a way, implementing a deep time perspective on the individual fate in life. And of course, the karma doctrine, which assumes that human actions have not only repercussions in the present, but also longue durée consequences for the individual self or soul transmigrating through these different bodies. Furthermore, many Indian religions accept the idea that the world is subject to periodical dissolutions and recreations, an idea which is often and rather misleadingly meant when talking about cyclical time, meaning everything repeats itself, so the world vanishes and returns and everything starts anew and the same, which is actually quite misleading, because according to classical Indian concepts, the time of the world we live in is counted in long time units and measures of millions and billions of years, and thus works with a linear time concept. In this long history of the world, of the cosmos, temporary destructions and recreations of the world are part of this long onward linear movement of what could be called Indian cosmic time. And just to bring this concepts and the terminology across, I have put some of these terms on some slides. So we have here what I call cosmic or socio-cosmic time in classical Hinduism, which measures the time of the present world in units of eons, world periods of so-called world teachers and world ages. And you can see here the eon is the big unit, and this is counted in world periods, and the world periods are counted in sequences of so-called world ages, and these time units of the world ages always come in a set of 4 ages, and the beginning and the end, particularly the end of this kind of set of 4 world ages, is marked by a temporary dissolution or destruction of the world, after which the next time unit of this 4 period or 4 ages cycle starts anew. Now, the most important measure or time unit, which is relevant for also defining the tasks of human beings and the role of human beings in the history of the cosmos, is the time unit of the sequence of the 4 world ages, the so-called Yugas. And in this time unit is actually also our present time, according to classical Hindu concepts, which are, of course, also very relevant for Hindus in nowadays, and also even Indian perspectives on our current crisis is often formulated in reference to this idea of the 4 world ages. And this idea of the 4 world ages comprises a total of 3.6 million years. So it's clearly a long perspective, and this is only for one of the 4 world ages. And you have seen there are 71 of these 4 world ages in one of these world periods. So the Indian cosmic time really reckons with what I think one could call a deep time perspective, or at least a very longue durée perspective. This cosmic time and the interpretation of the cosmic time is connected to the concept of cosmic order, which is deeply ingrained in all Indian cosmologies and is relevant in particular for Hindu religious traditions. The idea of Dharma, of cosmic order, I will come back to that in a moment. And the sequence of the 4 world ages is marked by a gradual deterioration of cosmic order, basically because human beings always or every time prove more or less unable to keep cosmic order running and sustain it. And at the end of this deterioration, we have a dissolution and recreation of the world, which you can, in a way, in presentism talk or language, you could call it, it's a reset of the conditions that enable to have a new start of the general framework, which allows all beings in the cosmos to have a livelihood and to secure or ensure their existence. This is just a note. Maybe those of you who do classics, of course, it may be recalled that this reminds of the ancient Greek idea of the 4 world ages. In the Indian context, we have also these 4 world ages, but they are not classified according to metals. So we don't have the golden age ending in the Iron Age, but it's classified according to the throws of dice, of the dice game. So it starts with the perfect throw and it ends with the loser throw, the Kali Yuga, which is our present age. So the Kali Yuga is our age of now. And since we all live currently also according to Hindu perspective in the Kali Yuga, it's the 28th Kali Yuga of one of these time periods. It started about 3000 BCE. And this is the age basically we are living in. And it is an age of crisis and marked by all the phenomena we are observing, total damage of the ecosystem, a kind of catastrophes, natural catastrophes, but of course also epidemics, pandemics, and so on can all be in a way framed in this or translated into this idea of a cosmic order and a time at the brink of dissolution, which means, which has 2 aspects. The one aspect is, of course, crisis is the normal. And on the other hand, it's also a call to change things as much as possible in order to have a good position when things are restart and we have a reset of the world order when after dissolution we have a kind of recreation process. So the age of now is very important, I said so, and the Kali Yuga you find a lot in contemporary discussions of the ecological crisis. Of course, also the Corona crisis was also currently discussed in India, also under this perspective. And crisis is not something where you should just put your hands off and say, okay, it's all too late, but no, it's the wake-up call to act, to counteract as much as possible. Okay, I said that this deep time perspective is intrinsically connected to a religiously framed and interpreted idea of a socio-cosmic order, which is in Sanskrit called Dharma. And the socio-cosmic order comprises laws of nature and society. So it's always thinking together nature and society. But this does not mean, as it is sometimes represented in the West, that there is no idea of nature in India and no idea of society. This is not true, but there is this kind of interconnectedness between laws of nature and what is going on in society. And this means that these laws and this order is the basis for the subsistence of all living beings. And I want to emphasize this because this distinguishes Indian cosmologies, I think, from what was addressed by Amanda in her presentation in the medieval context. And of course, it's well known, the Genesis tale. It's not a cosmology in which everything is oriented towards the human beings, but it is a cosmos which is construed as a network of interdependence. So it's a mutual interdependence and dependency between all living beings, and the cosmos consists of different habitats of this living beings. And living beings means humans, animals, plants, and also the elements like earth and water are all counted as living and as contributing to the subsistence and the existence of the cosmic order of the world. And it's not about survival in the first place, but it's an order which has also an aesthetic, you could even say a positive dimension, that it also is an order, if it's kept, which allows a good life. So this mutual dependency of all beings is always, or in many sources, discussed in relation not to the food chain, which is a typically Western idea of the food chain, but of the food cycle, which means that these living beings, in a way, subsist from the other. They are digestible to a certain extent by each other. And this then means that one has, in order to secure one's own survival as a human being, one has to take care that other living beings in the cosmos also keep their habitats and they are allowed to live. And there is a nice comparison or a metaphor you find in many sources. It's often compared with the relationship, this mutual dependency between the forest and the tigers. So the tigers protect the forest and the forest protects the tigers. When the forest is gone, the tigers are gone. When the tigers are gone, the forest is gone as well. So what is then the task of human beings in this socio-cosmic order? The task of humans is, of course, from a religious perspective, to transcend this world order and to gain liberation, which is a slightly different topic. I won't go into that in my presentation. If this comes up in the discussion, I will be happy to discuss this. But when it comes to the world order, one basic fundament of what humans need to do also in order to gather and obtain religious merits and at the end of the day, freedom and liberation from suffering, is to sustain the world order. And this means to accept one's responsibility towards the world order and also to accept that once you are living and existing, you are living in debts. You are living on credit, so you have to return and pay back some of these debts in your lifetime. And so the task of humans is to understand the mutual dependency of all beings in this cosmos and to take care that there is some reciprocity, which means that one has to compensate the constant need, that consumption needs to, means that somebody has to sacrifice himself, herself, itself in order that others live. This is what then is the illustration of what I meant with the food cycle. So it means that you are asked to compensate for the consumption of resources. And this is maybe also one point which may explain why rituals play such an important role in Hindu religions, because rituals are, or ritual and sacrificial ritual is the hub, is the mechanism which organizes this reciprocity and this acknowledgement of constant consumption and outtake of resources, meaning other living beings living life and also resources of their living, and this you need to compensate. And one major point or consequences of this whole setup is that non-violence plays a central role and is an ethical concern, not only in theory of morality, but also basically in daily life as something that you try to take care to reduce the violence of your daily consumption as much as possible. So this is an important issue. I could go on, of course, as we all could, and point out that this idea of world order is also backed up by a philosophical idea of nature, which is, I think, also a very important conceptual resources for environmental debates, because it has a different kind of construction, this concept, which distinguishes it from Western concepts, but I won't go into that. And so let me just conclude. So as I hope to have demonstrated, Indian cosmic time is connected to a religious cosmology that includes human beings from the very beginning of time. This inclusion of humans distinguishes religious cosmologies from modern scientific ones that also focus on pre-human and post-human phases of planetary history. Nevertheless, Indian religious cosmologies, with their cosmic time reckoning, resonate with ideas of deep time. And this resonance is effaced when clinging to the idea that this is all about cyclical time. So I think it's rather this deep time is much more matching and also allows to recognize and maybe also to engage intellectually with this kind of framing of the world and the interconnectedness of all beings in the world. However, I do not mean to make the point that these Indian notions of time can be equated with the today's debates because it reckons with humans as central agents in the history of the world. Yet we find in Indian religions and philosophies an interpretation of human agency and thus conceptual resources, which may prove helpful for a more globalized discussion of the ecological crisis and for a reorientation of human self-perception and human practice in the framework of deep time. Despite all the differences in idea and practices, one can say that such a reorientation of human practices is a common goal of religions or certain religions, which makes the study of these religions relevant, I think, for coping with the current crisis at an intellectual level, and of course also when including a more globalized discourse in these discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Angelika. That was wonderful. Are you ready?
Yes, thank you very much. Good evening to you all. I'm in Shanghai China today, sometimes the internet goes a bit wonky. So if you find that you can't hear what I'm saying, could somebody just interrupt me, and I'll try and I'll turn off my video, and that sometimes helps. So I'd like to thank again Natasha and Tim for inviting me to participate in this conference. I'm a professor at Duke Kunshan University. This is a joint venture partnership between Duke University in the USA and Wuhan University in China. And it's located in Kunshan, which is a city just outside of Shanghai. And I hope that you will all have the chance to come and visit whenever that becomes possible. So I'd like to talk about the ideas of time, and especially deep time, in relationship to Taoism, which is China's organized indigenous religion. Taoism as a religious tradition has existed, as an organized religious tradition, has existed for nearly 2,000 years, and for longer than that as a group of philosophies, ideas, meditation practices that were not really formalized or institutionalized until the 2nd century of the Common Era. As you can imagine, the impact of Taoism in contemporary China as a religious tradition is relatively minimal in China today. Buddhism is a much more established and prosperous religious tradition than Taoism for a whole variety of historical reasons dating back 300 or 400 years. But Taoism continues to exert considerable influence on mainstream Chinese culture through ideas with which I'm sure you're familiar, ideas of yin and yang, balance, harmony, and so forth, many of which are shared with Confucian intellectual traditions and other broader elements of Chinese culture. But the foundation of Taoism is the idea of Dao, which translates as a way or path. And for me, this is a very interesting concept because it's a foundational concept for this philosophical and religious tradition, but one that links space and time together, understanding the cosmos not simply as a static place or a kind of order or disposition of things that is given to us in some kind of preformed state, but rather it imagines the cosmos as a dynamic process, a way, a path, something that is always on the move from one place to another. And you can see this elision, if you like, or coming together of space and time in modern Chinese. The word for the universe in modern Chinese it's a 2-character word, meaning it's called Yuzhou. And the 2 components of this, the first word, Yu, basically means the space that surrounds us, and Zhou means the passage of time from the past into the future. So the universe has, for a long time in China been imagined as a kind of space-time continuum, if you like, perhaps in some ways presaging or the kind of contemporary ideas that have emerged in Einstein's cosmology later on. But one consequence of this connection of space and time in the idea of Tao is that when you look at the intellectual history in China, there's not a very deep or extensive reflection on time as a kind of discrete concept or as an abstract idea that could be differentiated from other aspects of cosmology or Chinese intellectual history. And in Joseph Needham's Science and Civilization in China, he has a discussion of time, noting that first of all this concept of space-time, Yuzhou, and then the next most kind of the most common word that is used for time in China is the word shi, which basically means the if we can imagine the passing of time, but it also has the implication of timeliness, or doing things at the right time or in the right season, cohering with the cyclical processes of time. And this is a very important element in traditional Chinese culture. Certain kinds of foods are to be eaten at certain times of the year. In the imperial sacrifices, the emperor was, in effect, his job was to coordinate the cycles of the agricultural season in China with the cycles of the rotations of the heavens. I'm sure many of you may have been to Beijing to visit the Temple of Heaven, where the emperor offered sacrifices, and at certain times of the year, the emperor was supposed to show up wearing certain kinds of colors, certain kinds of animals would be sacrificed, and this was all with a view to trying to make sure that the earthly time and the heavenly time were always in sync with each other. So that's a very common cultural disposition that persists today in contemporary Chinese society, and it's based on this idea of the cyclical nature of the seasons and the importance of adapting human life to that seasonality. And then Needham also talks about a third Chinese term, zhou, which means the duration of things. So rather that emphasizes how something might persist through time. But he goes on to note that time as an abstract concept hasn't really received that much philosophical attention in China, perhaps in comparison to the attention that it's received either within the Christian theological tradition or Western philosophy. However, there was in 2019 an important conference on Taoism and time at Loyola Marymount College in Los Angeles. And this was held in not conjunction with, but following on from the 17th Triennial Conference of the International Society for the Study of Time. I'm not sure if many of you are aware of this organization. It was established about 50 years ago by a man called J.T. Fraser, and who developed a whole kind of theory of what he calls 6 chronotypes, or frames of time that shape the human experience. And if you're not familiar with his work, he doesn't really talk about deep time in the same way that this is, that we talk about it today. But he has some analogous kinds of ideas. So I know we don't have a lot of time here in this presentation. So I really wanted to focus on what I think of as a kind of outstanding or unusual feature of thinking about time from the Daoist perspective. And this is the relationship between time and creativity. And I think this relationship between time and creativity puts the Chinese viewpoint on a slightly different footing from that, I think, both familiar in Indian philosophy and also in Western philosophy. And I think a common understanding of time that we can see in Western and Indian philosophy is that time is basically associated with change, and change fundamentally means decay or loss. So time means the transformation of something that is into something that it's not. And this is often perceived as a kind of a loss of identity or a decay of identity. Whatever the original thing was, through the process of time, it's become what it wasn't. And one scholar recently wrote, he says, the transience of time originates from a sense of loss. And it's in the sense of loss that the passage of time is most clearly, even painfully felt. All present and future is inevitably becoming past. Everything that is gained in time will eventually be lost. Moments are given, then gone. Life is given to us, running toward death every minute. All beings have already, or are becoming, or will become non-being. And I think many of us might be, familiar with that kind of sensibility. But I think the difference in the Taoist context is that this transition or transformation that occurs through the process of time is also viewed positively. And if we imagine Tao as this wellspring for cosmic transformation that occurs throughout the universe, this path of space-time, what we see is that the passage of time, alteration, transience, things becoming what they're not, is precisely the source of life. That is to say, it's this change or alteration or loss, if you think about it negatively, is precisely what enables life to take place. And biologically, we know that the processes of evolution couldn't take place without the deaths of individual organisms. And from this point of view, death is something that enables life, growth, and evolution to take place. So rather than viewing transience with a sense of loss or regret, I find that Taoists tend to celebrate the transitory nature of life as something that's intrinsic to vitality. To move or to change or to alter over time is what it means to be alive. And to remain the same, preserved, unaltered, is a kind of rather horrifying prospect, because that's what death looks like. And there are many interesting stories in Taoist philosophical literature about people adapting to these unanticipated changes. So for instance, in Zhuangzi, there are many interesting stories about people who we would, in our modern day, we would say that they were people with disabilities, people who have lost limbs, people who are disfigured in some way. And these people are held up as kind of moral exemplars, people who have embraced this kind of change, which was unanticipated or unwanted, but have somehow grown through that. And there are many stories as well of mythical creatures, animals transforming into other animals. And the sensibility here is that these changes, even if they are unexpected or unanticipated changes, are actually the precondition for any kind of life. And therefore, this produces a slightly different attitude towards death and mourning. And I think this is something that I'd like to reflect a little bit later on when we thinking about the mourning of extinctions of species and those kinds of the world that we live in together. The other way that this transformation is exemplified is in the alchemical tradition that emerged in later Taoism in China. And here, the goal of alchemy is producing what we might imagine to be a kind of elixir of immortality. But the alchemical tradition was not actually about enabling people to live permanently in some human embodied status, but was rather about trying to absorb the transformative powers of nature into the body, so that the body could become something more than human, so that the body could be transformed into some kind of non-material or spiritual or perfected body. So even though Taoism is well known for its interest in longevity and immortality, this is not so much about preserving the status quo, but enabling a more radical transformation to take place. So I'd like to address this concept of deep time and answer some of the questions posed by the conference organizers. And I think the contemporary notion of deep time suggests, obviously, a move towards thinking in larger timescales than that of human life, And one obvious way that this has happened, as we have already learned in history and other disciplines, is placing the story of human life within that of the 4.5 or 7 billion year history of the Earth, or even the 13.8 billion year history of the universe. And as I'm sure you're all aware, there have been many attempts to write these kinds of stories and inscribe human life within this larger framework. And one of the ways that this has been done that has been very interesting to me has been that of the project called A Journey of the Universe by Brian Swim and Mary Evelyn Tucker from the Forum on Religion and Ecology at Yale University. And this is partly because Mary Evelyn Tucker began life as a scholar of Confucian philosophy. And in that film and that telling of the story of the universe, there are many ways in which it evokes certain kinds of Chinese sensibilities that have a resonance, at least within Chinese cultural history, but which aren't really explicitly made clear in the film. And when I show the film to my students, the part that always gets them the most is where Brian Swim intones something like "the stars are our ancestors," and this to me is a kind of a deeply filial sensibility. It's almost a kind of a Confucian idea that recalls this famous text called the Western Inscription, written by the Confucian philosopher Zhou Dunyi. He says, "Heaven is my father, and earth is my mother, and even such a small creature as I finds an intimate place in their midst." And this is a very celebrated document in which I think something like the grandeur of this deep space-time is also presented as a moment of extreme intimacy, the outer space of the stars and planets conjoined with the inner space of the human body. And this evokes this patterning of a kind of macrocosm relationship. The universe and the body are in some ways reflections of each other. And this has been a leitmotif of Daoist philosophy and Daoist religion. And I think previously I had really thought about this in kind of cosmological space terms. And I think I'm very good for the conference organizers for helping me to think about this, not just in terms of the space of the universe that is somehow contained within the inner recesses of the body, but also the time of the universe, which is somehow also imaged in the time or the experience of time somatically within the body. And so one way to do this is to think about our life emanating from these historical processes that go back all of these billions of years into the past. And I think that's one thing that I think has certainly been written about and I find quite interesting. But the flip side of that is that deep time invites us not only to think about the relation that human life in this deep historical time, but also into the future as well. And I apologize to David Farrier, who's speaking later on today, because I'm going to quote something that he wrote, which I think is very important for thinking about the long-term deep time effects of contemporary human life. And many of you may be familiar with the article that he published. I read it in The Atlantic, where he talks about two various kinds of misnamings that are central to our present world. And the first one is about plastics, which are anything but plastic, but rather persistent, things that don't change so much, but rather things that last into the deep future. And the second of these is, of course, the data cloud, which obviously implies something that is ephemeral or immaterial and heavenly. And David writes, despite the appealing connotations of the cloud, the data has to go somewhere. And he writes, Greenpeace estimates the power consumption of just one of Apple's immense data centers is equivalent to the annual supply of 250,000 European homes. Traces of this seemingly ephemeral data will persist into the deep time of the future as rising concentrations of carbon warm the atmosphere. So the value of this thinking about deep time is that it shows that we sometimes mistake transience and permanence. The things that we think of as transient are in fact instances of material persistence, whose effects will be felt a very way into the future and which can't easily undone. And from this point of view, this is a negative thing because, or at least from maybe a kind of imagined Daoist point of view, this doesn't contribute to the overall vitality of the cosmos. Why? Because in effect, they refuse to die. So what we need actually are things that are transient and impermanent, and what we don't need are things that persist too much. So finally, in my recent book that Natasha mentioned, I make this argument that this kind of received wisdom that humans are somehow supposed to save the environment is kind of misguided in a couple of ways. First of all, the idea of saving the environment preserves the notion that the environment is a thing that exists in space outside of our bodies, and is not, but rather this Daoist identification of the microcosm of the body and the macrocosm of the world around us suggests that we should not think of the environment as something that exists outside of the hermetically sealed walls of our bodies. And Daoist art is famous for its depiction of the inner body as a landscape, using images of mountains, clouds, stars, and heavenly beings to show the Daoist experience of vital energy flowing through the meridians of the body. What we should think of instead is the environment should be more like an environment, environment, something that insists deeply within our bodies, that informs our existence. The environment is not a backdrop on which human actions take place. Rather, it informs, insists, and indwells our bodies, enabling us to have life, subjectivity, freedom, and agency. And I think we can think about this the same way about deep time. If, from a Daoist perspective, the world indwells the body just as much as the body indwells the world, so also deep time inscribes itself in human history just as much as human history inscribes itself within some deeper time. And the result of this mutual imbrication of body and world, human time and deep time, isn't, from a Daoist perspective, the experience of transience as loss or death, but transformation as creative power. And to think through deep time is not to imagine human life as a transitory flash within the majestic unfolding of the evolution of the cosmos over 13.8 billion years, but rather to see our transience and the transience of the cosmos itself as complex, as yet undetermined processes of creativity. And inasmuch as human actions enable that transitory, creative, ephemeral processes to continue, they are to be celebrated. But inasmuch as they inhibit the flourishing of the world through ossification, they are to be deprecated. And our error comes when we mistake one for the other, when we treat plastics as disposable and data clouds as immaterial and ephemeral. Thank you.
Thank you very much, both of you, for these presentations. It's really wonderful to see a different perspective on deep time that isn't that brings a completely different angle to the environment, to this separation from human beings and the environment, to it being very much part of us, this indwelling, this in which informs and insists and indwells. It's this kind of way of thinking, I think, will really bring solutions to our crises at the moment, because to me it seems that it's this disconnection between man and the environment that are causing the issues. And in these traditions, it feels like there is a real connection between the environment and human beings. In fact, human beings aren't dominating the environment, they're very much part of it, they're very much within that. And so the first question I'd like to raise is, and just a reminder for the attendees, if you have questions, to put them in the Q&A box and to upvote. So my first question is to Angelika, and that's, you talked about cosmic time and how human beings have always been there, but how does that relate to or talk to the anthropocenic age that we're going through, where the environment, the massive changes in climate are due to man's or human beings' actions? And has that always, in this cosmic time place, is that always the case, or what? Can you talk to that?
Well, it somehow connects with what James Miller just said, because all this idea of environment and this double-edged idea of what is actually time and change is not always lost, but it's also, according to the Indian idea of karman, this idea that everything you do has a kind of a longue durée effect, is something, it's not a process of loss in Indian philosophy only, time, but it's a process also of accumulation, of consequences of what you are doing. And these consequences are more or less visible and more or less subtle. So in a way, when one wants to connect these classical concepts with the current situation, it's and this is also done by representatives of Hindu religious communities, where you adapt these concepts rather perfectly into these huge frameworks, that you could say, yes, and this that it's now in a way the tipping point of all these accumulation of self-centered carelessness of humans beings' desire to well-being and to enjoy life to the fullest and to get rid of suffering, of labor, and so on, resulted in massive interventions and violence in other living beings' habitats. And this is what I meant. This kind of every breath means also you produce something, but you also take something away. And if this is unbalanced, if only one species in the cosmos takes out and not returns anything, then of course this consumption of resources has huge repercussions, which accumulate on all sides. On the taking away and increasing the damage. It's an increase, it's not loss. It's from a karma perspective, Indian perspective, it's a huge accumulation of consequences. You could say it's a huge heap of garbage, which each and everybody consuming in the way we are now consuming, and so at least in certain parts of the world. And this you cannot just undo. And this is why this idea of reciprocity and of understanding the mutual dependency, and this is of course the dependency of bodies. This is the food cycle. And so this is very, very, very matching. And this is why there is this idea of the crisis of the moment is also a chance. It's a wake-up call now to undo certain things and to stop, in a way, accumulating the errors, or the intervention and the violence and so on. And so this, I think, yes, one needs more things to go away. But from the Indian perspective, it's very hard to do so. It takes a long time to undo your errors, to undo the wrongs. And this is why you have this idea of a reset in order to allow that. A reorientation of human agency.
That's wonderful, thank you. And James, what does Taoism say about the Anthropocene and this time that we're in that's just gone crazy with consumption and all of these other things?
Well, I think, we've always I think Taoism and Chinese traditions more broadly have always been very positive in general about the engagement between human beings and the natural world, and have seen consumption, for instance, as generally speaking a desirable thing. So I mean, there have been let's say ascetic movements where people have somehow attempted to reduce their consumption of products, but I would largely see the idea that that the consuming of things from the natural world, this is what nature gives this is what nature gives to us, and this is what makes our lives happy and fulfilling. The issue is really about imbalance. I think that's the main. So in general, Daoists are not doer Presbyterians who who would have us all go and live in the middle of nowhere. I think they are, but I think the main issue I think is really about balance, and the idea of the human engagement with the natural world is generally seen as a positive, as a positive thing. So from that point of view, I think the way it frames the kinds of moral issues that have arisen about what does it mean to live in this Anthropocene age, I think are quite different from the kinds of themes that we have seen emerge in environmental movements in the West. And I think at this, and I think this is really why I'd like to, I think the point that Angelika Malinar made at the very beginning about the importance of embracing perspectives that lie outside of this kind of Western experience, I think is extremely important. And I think what we see, like in the history of religious studies or cross-cultural studies of religion, has been an increasing attempt not to understand these cultural traditions or moral problems from within the framework that is already given to us, in the West, but to try and begin to theorize from non-Western, from non-Western perspectives. But it produces, I mean, I think, what I'm always trying to show is that this produces things that are somewhat unexpected. So I think in my term, I think this idea that has emerged, in the West about saving the planet. For me, thinking about this from a kind of Chinese perspective, it sounds deeply Christian, and God has given us this planet to live on, or Islamic as well. In Islamic theology, we are the vicegerents of God, and it's our responsibility to manage this place that has been given to us by God. Fine, but I just don't think that way of thinking about the relationship between human beings and the natural world is one that really emerges very clearly in Chinese philosophy, which has much more taken the idea that nature is this amazing place that provides all these wonderful things for us, which are there for us to enjoy. The question is how do we do this without killing the golden goose that laid the golden, whatever the phrase is. And so nature is this bountiful, flourishing, amazing thing that we have, and so long as it continues to, but we are damaging it, and we are inhibiting nature's ability to allow us to flourish. So I think it's a deeply anthropocentric perspective. The end goal is for the benefit of human beings, but it's also gives nature a much stronger voice, perhaps.
Thank you. We've got a few minutes for questions. The first one being from Nina: Eastern Orthodox Christianity and idea of self-emptying and practice of vegan diet, which amounts to 6 months in each year, and framework within concepts of quantum rather than Newtonian physics, all matter as holy. Would either of you like to address that?
I can, well, it's as I said, it's religious discourses engage in reorienting human agency. And I think there's a difference between ascetic religions trying to turn away from the world at all, and also trying to reduce consumption as a way to liberate oneself from the limitations of embodiment. But there are also other religions, and classical Hinduism or ancient Vedic religion, perhaps Taoism also, I don't know, they would say, yes, desire is something positive. So of course, the desire to live good for well-being is a goal humans should pursue in life. But on the other hand, at least in India, they were deeply troubled with the violence that the mere existence takes. So yes, the beauty of nature and all that, but it was there's a kind of sorrow and a kind of concern. Well, it always means that anybody has to die, if it's a plant or an animal, and so on. And this is something where the ritual, the idea of ritual, symbolic, but also really material retribution plays such an important role. And this is why also Indian religions are so concerned with food exchange and food transactions in recognizing that. So I think you could say, yes, ascetic religions really have a consequence there. But the big objection always that comes from those who stay in the world and try to negotiate the violence implied in satisfying desires and eating and drinking is that they would say, even if you practice self-emptying, if I understood this correctly, even if you sit in a monastery and only eat twice, you still eat, you breathe, you drink water, animals will be consumed, so you can never escape. So they would say, so better negotiate it. Yeah, live a good life in a way that allows others also to stay alive. And this is simply a different idea of religion. I would agree that this idea of saving and we have in the center is quite a Western idea. Indian religion is very skeptical that humans can change within a year their habits. Very skeptical. It takes a long time.
I think the doctrine of non-harm or non-violence, I think that is so key to the Indian philosophical and religious world. I think just doesn't really exist in the Chinese way of thinking in the same kind of way. And interestingly, there was one phrase or concept that that has been written about, which is to imagine the world as three kinds of powers or abilities: the human, the earthly world, including animals and so forth, and then the heavenly world. And the relationship between these is each steals from the other, right? And so long as this is kept in a kind of dynamic equilibrium, this is great, right? But if there's an imbalance in this, then it's problematic. But the notion of taking something from somewhere is seen as that actually is what it means to be alive, right? And by living, we are taking things. We're taking resources, we're taking air, we're taking water, and this is not thought of in a negative. This is not in itself immoral, right? Or it's understood as harm, but rather it's actually celebrated, because that's what enables us to have life in the first place. So long as this process can continue and doesn't get out of equilibrium, then this is a good thing. So I think that's a very different kind of moral framing of the relationship between human life and the life of other animals and plants and so forth on our world.
Thank you. And that different framing, I think, is really useful, especially in the crisis situation that we're in. Priya had a question, and this will be the last one. Since the environment is very much a political issue, how does one integrate arguments that emerge from religion into dominant Eurocentric discourse in the public sphere of liberal democracies, given non-Judeo-Christian understandings are largely excluded from this space?
Well, I think I maybe I ended with this, or started with this idea of non-European and European. I think we really need to address this deep time issue and the Anthropocene and so on across cultures. It's to engage in a globalized discourse in this. One needs to include and have an interest in a genuine interest in really how this is dealt with in other religious, cultural, social contexts. And I personally find this quite striking, that in my experience is that the interest in these other conceptual resources, or even the possibility there could be non-Western conceptual resources, is shrinking. It's not something which is where I thought maybe 30 years ago I had this idea there was a more openness, a genuine interest in that, and now it's somehow something where you have this whole idea of East-West is in a way returning. And I think such an event as today is a good occasion to rethink that, and also always to remind, wait a minute, it's not just the West inviting the rest to participate in a certain discourse, because in India and South Asia and these issues are also discussed. They have their own ways to engage with it, and we won't in a way address the damage and the crisis if we just say, okay, what can we do from the European side and so on. But I think it's very important also to notice and to have an interest in what is going on else, the so-called rest elsewhere. Yeah.
And I would just say that in as much as that the environmental crisis is the product of, in part, of centuries of Western colonialism, and in as much as it is actually our liberal democracies in Europe and America that have contributed so much to the present ecological crisis. I mean, it's perhaps I think the big challenge, for the liberal democracies is to acknowledge this, and then also to seek voices that are especially marginalized voices, whether it's from indigenous peoples or elsewhere. And I think this is something that is happening in New Zealand and Canada. And I think this is, but I mean, what will happen in Europe, I think, is that's obviously a different political colonial kind of context, and I think that somehow it has to involve the unwinding of these colonial relationships between Europe and Africa and other parts of the other parts of the world, and that will result in some transformation of politics and governance systems, because it's precisely the liberal democratic systems that have played an important role in enabling all of the global traffic in goods and slaves and other things that has, in part contributed to our present ecological crisis.
Thank you both, Angelika and James, for joining us today. That was really rich, and I feel like we just got started and really unpicked actually what's going on here. And I apologise to all of the people in the Q&A, numbering well over 10, who asked questions that we weren't able to answer. We clearly needed at least another hour with you both, which isn't surprising, to be honest. So we've got lots to ponder over the break. Our next session, Philosophy and Ethics in Deep Time, will start at 12 p.m. So we'll see you there.